The first array extension method that was introduced in ES6 is Array.of, and the syntax is pretty straightforward. So you have array class .of, and this method can accept n number of arguments. So you can pass in, let's say, 7, 4, and 3, and we can basically assign this to a variable. Let us call in a const, name it array, and we can console log the result. And you can see that it generates an instance of an array with the arguments that were passed as the elements of that array. So the question becomes, why was this method introduced? And this method was introduced to cure something that the array constructor used to do. Notice, when I pass in the value 7 into the array constructor, we shall end up with an array of length 7, but notice that it is empty. But if I pass in 7 string, it basically creates an array with the 7 as the element. So that was very confusing. You will not be able to tell what to expect in case you passed a string or a number. So you had to make sure that you do type conversion beforehand. So the Array.of method was introduced to cure that discrepancy and that confusion. But from where I see, I've not come across a scenario where I'll have to use Array.of. So in my case, I usually just stick to using the array literal syntax. I mean, it is pretty simple, straightforward, easy to read and to understand. So in most cases, I just stick with the array literal syntax. The second array extension method that was introduced in ES6 is Array.from. And the syntax is also straightforward. We call the array class .from, and it accepts 2 parameters. The first parameter is an array-like object, and the second parameter is a callback function. And then we can have a third parameter, which can be the scope parameter, this argument. So it depends with where you're calling this method, but in most cases, we can just leave it out. So array-like methods, what are those? A good example would be when you are working with a normal or a regular function, it contains an arguments object, and that will be referred to an array-like function because it has the length property, but you cannot have, or it does not have, other array methods that are attached to it. Let us look at an example. So let's say we have a function called sum, and it accepts a number of parameters. I know with ES6, you can basically use the rest param. So if you don't know about that, I'll be linking up to my video in the card above. So go out and check that out. So with every regular function, we have what we call the arguments object. And Array.from, we can basically pass in the argument object, and we can be able to manipulate. So we can get the element, and we can console the results. We can pass in any number of parameters. So let's just say 1, 3, 4 element. And you can see that we have access to the different elements in the array-like object. Let us console the object so that you can see the structure. And you can see that we have an iterator, and I think it has a length property. And basically that's it. So you can basically be able to access elements in an array-like object. So Array.from. But the interesting bit is when we return the elements, then we end up with something even more interesting. Because remember, now we can console log the array method and end up with an array. I mean, this is pretty easy. So before this, we basically had a way to convert this to an array. And the way to do that, we can basically use the array prototype method. So array.prototype dot let's say map, for instance, then dot call. And we can be able to pass in the arguments object and have a callback function. And the callback function will basically act as the map. So we can have the element. I think we can just return out the element in the array. And when we console out the results, you can see that we're getting a similar result. That is pretty neat. We can shorten this even further by just using the literal syntax. Shortcode is always nice. And boom, we end up with the same thing. I actually think for this we can do the same thing. Nah, we can't. So Array.from makes it easy to use to convert array-like object into a proper array. And by doing that, we can easily access array methods, things like .find, .findIndex, .map. You have access now to the entire list of array methods. The other array extension method that was introduced in ES6 is Array.find. Let's say I have an array of numbers, const, and we have a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We can basically be able to find an element of an array by using Array.find. For instance, we can call in the Array.find. Let us just do it in the same line. .find. Then the first item, a callback function, and the callback function has the element, the index, and finally we have the array. So the array is also passed in. And we can be able to have a condition to find. So for example, we can say return. It will basically return true if the element is equal to 4. And we can console the results. And we end up with an array. So if the element is equal to 4, it returns the result. This is usually very good when it comes to dealing with array of objects. Let us try that example because it will work well. So we have an array of object, which I'll just use 2 for simplicity, ID 1, and name Kelvin. Then we can have ID 2, can have another name, John. So we can basically be able to test like, hey, if element.id is equal to 4, return that object. And you can clearly see if it doesn't exist, we get undefined. But if it exists, and in this case, let us use 1, you can see that it returns Kelvin. Maybe one important thing to note is it returns the first element with that ID. So let us just duplicate and have 1 that repeats. And you can see it doesn't reach this object because it basically returns the first element that matches that condition. Similar to Array.find method, another method that was introduced in ES6 is Array.findIndex. And it works similarly to .find, but the only difference is it returns the index of the item that meets the condition that was set in the array. In this case, you can see that ID1, basically the element is on the 0 index. That is the only difference. And if it doesn't match, it basically returns -1. So those are the array methods that were introduced in ES6.